The red light blinked at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Eleanor Marsh was already awake. She had been sitting at her workbench with a cup of black tea going cold beside a disassembled pressure gauge, not reading, not working, just existing in the particular silence that belongs only to people who have learned to distrust quiet. The proximity sensor mounted above the security console was a small thing, a matte black disc barely larger than a poker chip, and its indicator was the dullest shade of red imaginable, a color chosen deliberately so it wouldn't startle, so it would simply inform. Eleanor had installed it herself on a Tuesday afternoon 18 months ago, pressing the mounting screws in with the same unhurried precision she brought to every task. She had run the wire herself, soldered the connection herself, tested the sensitivity, threshold herself until it would not trigger for deer or wind-driven debris, but only for something that moved with the irregular, purposeful rhythm of a human body. Now it was blinking. She set down the gauge and walked to the console without urgency. The exterior cameras were useless. She already knew that, had known it since the barometric pressure began its catastrophic descent 6 hours earlier. The lenses painted over with driven ice so thoroughly they showed nothing but white static. But the seismic sensors embedded in the concrete pad above her head were still transmitting, and what they reported was not the rhythmic shuddering of structural debris in high wind. The pattern was uneven, desperate, organic. Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the cold steel of the primary hatch and stood very still. Through 2 feet of reinforced concrete and 2 inches of structural steel, through the mechanical howl of a storm that had been detonating across the cold river valley for the past 6 hours, she heard it. The sound arrived not as sound exactly, but as vibration, something translating itself through all that matter and reaching her hand and then traveling up through her wrist and arm and into the center of her chest, where it registered as something her engineering mind refused to name. Human fists, weakening with every impact. She stood with her hand against the hatch for a full 90 seconds. She counted them. Not because she needed to think the decision architecture had already resolved itself in the time it took her to cross the room, but because she understood that what she was about to do would alter every calculation she had made over the past 2 years, and a person owed themselves at least 90 seconds before they dismantled the arithmetic of their own survival. 3 years before this night, Eleanor had not been afraid of the sky. She had been, if anything, the kind of person who found comfort in open space, who ate lunch on the fire escape of her office building in Des Moines, even in March, who insisted on hiking trails that broke above the tree line where the wind had nothing to obstruct it. Her husband Daniel would follow her up those exposed ridge lines, shaking his head at the view, not because he disliked it, but because he was constitutionally suspicious of any experience that didn't involve wood grain and the smell of sawdust. He was a carpenter in the old sense, someone who understood materials by touch, who could identify oak from maple in the dark, who had built the kitchen cabinets in their house over 3 weekends with a hand plane and a patience that Eleanor had watched with something close to reverence, recognizing in it a discipline different from but equal to her own. The Dureco arrived on a Thursday afternoon in August. Eleanor had been in the kitchen making coffee when the light changed, not dimmed, not darkened, but changed in quality, turned the color of a bruise that had been aging for 9 days, a specific yellow-purple that she would spend the next 3 years trying to describe to people and failing. The radio on the counter was playing something, and then it wasn't because the electricity went. She remembered the window above the sink. She remembered turning toward it. She remembered the moment she understood what the absence of the small outbuilding in the yard signified, because the building had been there when she turned and was not there when she finished turning, and the interval between those 2 states was smaller than a heartbeat. There was no debris field. There was no dramatic collapse. The structure had simply ceased to participate in the physical world, and Daniel Marsh with it. The grief counselor Eleanor saw twice and then stopped seeing had described her response as dissociative, which Eleanor felt was an imprecise term for what was actually happening. She was not dissociating. She was problem-solving. The problem was that the sky could reach down and take things, and the solution to that problem was architecture. She understood this clearly in the same way she had always understood structural loads and material tolerances in the behavior of concrete under lateral stress. The grief was real and present, and she was not avoiding it. She carried it the way a column carries weight distributed through every part of her load-bearing. But grief without action was just weather, and Eleanor had decided she was done being rained on. She found the property listing for Cold River, Wyoming on a Thursday night in October, 14 months after the derecho, while sitting at the same kitchen table where she had turned and looked through the window. 10 acres in the northern foothills of the Absaroka range elevation, 5,800 feet terrain, described as rocky and largely unimproved. The seller was a retired rancher named William Abernathy, who had grazed cattle on the lower pasture for 40 years and found the upper acreage too uneven to be useful for much of anything. Eleanor drove out the following weekend, walked every foot of the property in the November cold, and spent 40 minutes kneeling in the shallow drainage cut on the north slope, pressing her palms against the exposed bedrock. The granite was massive and unbroken. She made an offer on her phone in the parking lot of the motel in Cold River before she had even driven back to town. What Abernathy thought he was selling was a retirement mistake. Land too rough for cattle, too remote for a vacation property, too elevation stressed for conventional agriculture. What Eleanor was buying was the bedrock. More specifically, she was buying what the bedrock could support if the engineering was correct, and Eleanor's engineering was always correct. The financing required creativity. The life insurance policy on Daniel had covered the mortgage on the Des Moines house, which Eleanor sold 9 months after the funeral, to a young couple who had admired the kitchen cabinets during the walkthrough. She liquidated the small architectural firm she had built over a decade, not sold because there were no buyers, for a one-person structural practice whose principal had stopped answering her phone but simply closed, settling the accounts and transferring the remaining clients to a colleague in Ames. The combined proceeds were significant but not sufficient, and so Eleanor had spent 2 weeks in the spring studying the agricultural zoning statutes for Carbon County, Wyoming, with the same focus she brought to building codes, until she found what she needed: a low-interest infrastructure development loan available to landowners in designated agricultural counties for the construction of storage and processing facilities. Eleanor's property qualified. Her project, classified meticulously in the application as a high-capacity agricultural root cellar and climate-controlled wine storage facility, qualified as well. The loan officer in Rawlins had asked no questions she couldn't answer with a straight face. The approval came in 3 weeks. She hired the excavation crew from a company based in Colorado that specialized in underground infrastructure: cisterns, bunker, foundations, telecommunications conduits. 4 men and a tracked excavator who arrived on a Monday and asked no questions beyond what the engineering drawings required of them. Eleanor had prepared those drawings herself over 6 months of evenings, drafting by hand, at first the way she had been trained, then transferring to CAD for the structural calculations. The crew worked for 11 days and left on a Friday afternoon, and Eleanor wrote them a check and stood in the raw, carved void beneath her property and began to understand the scale of what she was doing. The finished shelter measured 500 square feet, arranged with the spatial logic of a submarine rather than a residence, because Eleanor had not designed it for comfort and had no patience for the pretense that underground survival required amenities. The vestibule airlock occupied 25 square feet at the base of the entry stairwell, a concrete antechamber with its own sealed door functioning as a decompression space between the surface and the main structure. The primary living quarters held 2 narrow cots, a small table, and a single chair taking up 100 square feet. Medical storage ran along the east wall, is 65 square feet of shelving and locked cabinets. The hydroponic bay occupied 80 square feet under a bank of full-spectrum LED arrays, 4 shallow grow trays, capable of producing leafy greens and herbs on a continuous rotation. Dry goods shelving ran 60 square feet. The diesel generator occupied its own sound-dampened sub-chamber of 50 square feet, vented through a separate exhaust system. Bathroom and water storage took the remaining 55 square feet with a 300-gallon tank fed by a manual pump and a gravity filtration system. Every square foot had a purpose. No square foot had more than one. The heating system was geothermal, a closed-loop network of pipes driven 200 feet into the earth below the shelter floor, circulating fluid through the stable 55-degree zone and exchanging heat with the living space through radiant panels embedded in the concrete floor. It required electricity to run the circulation pumps, but produced warmth from the earth itself, independent of any fuel supply. The electrical system consisted of a bank of lithium iron phosphate batteries charged by a solar array mounted on the roof of the surface cabin, the panels disguised within what appeared to be a conventional standing seam metal roof. Under normal load, one-person minimal activity, the battery bank could sustain the shelter for roughly 3 weeks between meaningful recharging events. The diesel generator existed as a backup, only its 72-hour fuel supply, intended as a bridge across extended cloud cover, not as a primary power source. The air system was the element Eleanor had spent the most time designing because it was the one she trusted least. An underground space with no connection to the surface atmosphere is a sealed box, and sealed boxes kill their occupants through carbon dioxide accumulation before they kill them through oxygen depletion. The NBC filtration system she had installed, military surplus, reconditioned by a vendor in Nevada, included a bank of carbon dioxide scrubbers that would chemically absorb CO2 from the recirculated air, along with particulate and biological filters rated for nuclear and chemical contaminants. The intake pipe ran from a circulation manifold inside the shelter to the surface where it emerged through a length of hollow redwood stump positioned 14 feet northwest of the primary hatch, rising 2 feet above grade and painted with a weathered gray sealant that made it visually unremarkable at any distance greater than 10 feet. A motorized damper allowed Eleanor to seal the intake from inside in the event of a surface contamination event. She had tested the intake system in every weather condition that Cold River's first winter had offered her, lying awake listening to the fans and checking the CO2 readings on her environmental panel with the regularity of someone taking a patient's pulse. The intake pipe's position, 14 feet north-northwest, rising just 2 feet above grade, was the single point in the entire system she could not protect from the inside. She had noted this in her operational log during the first winter and had noted it again in the second, and the notation had never changed. The intake was the variable she trusted least. The single structural concession Eleanor had made to something other than pure function was the security console, a panel that held more monitoring instrumentation than any root cellar in the county required. Surface temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed at the solar array, battery state of charge, generator fuel level, CO2 concentration in parts per million. 3 camera feeds from the exterior mounted at the corners of the surface cabin in weatherproof housings aimed outward in arcs that covered every approach to the property. And the proximity sensor embedded in the concrete of the entry pad connected to the small matte black disc above the console, the one whose red indicator was now blinking in the dark. Frank Dolan was the first person in Cold River to use the phrase "the mole lady," and it spread from his hardware counter with the efficiency of any story that satisfies people's need to reduce unfamiliar behavior to something manageable. Eleanor had been buying materials from Dolan's Supply since her 3rd week in town, not because Frank ran the only hardware store within 40 miles, though he did, but because his inventory was genuinely comprehensive and his pricing was fair, and Eleanor was not interested in driving to Rawlins for rebar when she could get it delivered to her property by noon the following day. The trouble was that Frank Dolan could not process a large purchase without narrating it aloud. He was 54 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the particular physical confidence of a man who had never spent a significant period of time being doubted. He had grown up in Cold River and taken over the supply store from his father at 32, and built it into something considerably more profitable through a combination of good inventory management and an ability to make every customer feel they were buying from a friend rather than a business. He was not a cruel man. The amusement he took in Eleanor's purchases was not malicious. It was the amusement of someone who could not conceive of being afraid of weather, directed at someone whose behavior seemed to him a prolonged and expensive overreaction to an emotional event. He would tell his regulars at the Tuesday morning coffee gathering that formed organically around his counter, seen snow. He had lived through the winter of 2009 when the pass had been closed for 11 consecutive days and the town had operated entirely on what it had stocked. He had seen snow and he was not, as far as he could tell, building anything underground. The morning Eleanor loaded a pallet of moisture barrier cinder block into the bed of her pickup, Frank read the invoice aloud with the particular performance of a man who knew he had an audience. The 6 people in the store that morning, regulars farmers, a pair of hunters from Casper resupplying before their second week in the field, gave him the response he was looking for. He described the submarine-grade watertight hatch she had inquired about the previous week, his voice carrying the affectionate disbelief of a man recounting an absurdist comedy. The hunters laughed. The farmers smiled. Nobody in the store was unkind exactly. They were just comfortable. Eleanor signed the purchase order and picked up her copy. She folded it once and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she took one of her business cards from the card holder. On Frank's counter, she still had them, plain white cards with her name and a phone number left over from the architectural practice, and laid it on the countertop beside the register. "When you need it," she said, "call me." She walked out without clarifying what she meant. Frank picked up the card, read it, and put it in the drawer beneath the register where he kept things he didn't quite know what to do with. Cal Briggs was the only person in the store who didn't laugh. He was standing at the end of the counter with a cup of Frank's terrible coffee, reading the itemized invoice that Frank had left on the countertop before Eleanor took it. Cal was 47 years old and had spent his entire adult life diagnosing mechanical systems, what a thing was doing, what it should be doing, and what the gap between those two states indicated about the problem. He looked at the specification of the rebar gauge and the concrete mix ratio and the moisture barrier rating and the combined weight of the order, and he looked out the window at Eleanor's truck pulling out of the lot, and he said quietly, not quite to Frank and not quite to the room, "She knows what she's doing." Frank laughed at that too. Cal didn't argue. He finished his coffee and left. The code enforcement visit came in late October of Eleanor's second year on the property, when Richard Holt arrived in his county truck with a clipboard and a set of concerns that had been building since a neighboring landowner reported unusual topographical changes to Eleanor's north slope. Holt was 61 years old and had spent the first part of his career as a civil engineer on a municipal water infrastructure before moving into county code enforcement 15 years ago. And he was not easily fooled by agricultural zoning classifications. He had seen root cellars. He had permitted root cellars. He had a working knowledge of what root cellars required and what they did not require, and what Eleanor Marsh had apparently constructed on her property was not something he could categorize from the road. Eleanor met him at the gate with a folder of drawings in a calm that Holt later described to his wife as unsettling. She walked him through the complete permitting documentation, the agricultural loan application, the zoning classification, the utility permits, the grading plan filed with the county surveyor. Every form was complete. Every classification was technically defensible. Holt accepted the folder and opened it and began to work through the drawings with the focused attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. He stood over the main structural drawing for a long time without speaking. Eleanor stood beside him and said nothing. The drawing showed through the careful language of an agricultural storage facility, a structure that no reasonable person in Holt's position could misidentify as a root cellar. The wall thickness, the mechanical systems, the ventilation architecture. The entry sequence with its two-stage sealed access. Holt had spent 15 years looking at buildings, and this was not a building for storing vegetables or wine. He folded the drawings and returned them to Eleanor with the particular quiet of a man who has understood something he cannot act on. He stood beside his truck for a moment before opening the door. "You built this well." His voice carried a weight that made it different from a professional assessment. "I hope you never need to use it." Eleanor looked at him. "So do I," she said, and the honesty of it surprised her because she had said it many times before to different people and had never once meant it. Holt drove away, and Eleanor stood in her driveway watching the dust his tires raised until it settled, and then she went back underground. Her sister Rachel called from San Diego on a Sunday evening in late November when Eleanor was calibrating the intake fan pressure sensors. Rachel was 3 years younger and had inherited from their mother the ability to make concerns sound like accusation, which Eleanor had never held against her because she understood the mechanism. It came from love and the helplessness of loving someone at a distance. The call lasted 22 minutes. Eleanor held the phone between her ear and shoulder and continued working with her free hand because there was no version of this conversation that required her full attention. She had heard the core argument many times in many different forms, and she was not unmoved by it. She simply had no response that would satisfy Rachel, because the response would require Eleanor to explain something she wasn't sure had a name yet. Rachel said what she always said, that the bunker was not protection, it was avoidance. That building walls didn't address the thing living inside them. That Daniel was gone, and no amount of poured concrete was going to change that geography. Eleanor listened and didn't argue. Then Rachel said something she hadn't said before. She said, "You're not preparing for a disaster, Ellie. You're building a monument." The word landed differently than Rachel had probably intended. Monument. Eleanor thought about that while she finished adjusting the pressure valve, and then she said, without planning to say it, he wanted a porch that faced east, so he could have coffee and watch the sun come up. I told him east-facing would lose more heat in winter. She stopped. Rachel was quiet. I was right about the thermal efficiency. Eleanor looked at the fan housing in her hand. He said he didn't care. She didn't say anything else. The silence stretched until Rachel filled it with something soft and insufficient, and Eleanor said she had to get back to work and ended the call and sat down on the concrete floor of her shelter with her back against the battery bank and looked at the wall for a long time. Behind the dry goods shelving on the east wall, tucked in the space between the lowest shelf bracket and the floor, there was a cardboard tube she had brought with her from Des Moines. It was the kind of tube that architectural drawings shipped in the same diameter as the tubes she used for construction documents, indistinguishable from them at a glance. Inside it was a single sheet hand-drafted on the good vellum she had kept from the office, its lines a little less precise than her professional work, because the hand that had guided the pencil on several of the room dimensions had not been trained. In the lower right corner in lettering that mixed her architectural capitals with rounder, less practiced letters, DM plus EM Someday House, 2019. The floor plan showed a 2-bedroom house with a garden on the south side and a covered porch running the full width of the east elevation. Eleanor had drawn the structure. Daniel had pointed. She did not look at it often. She looked at it sometimes. Dr. Thomas Klein had been tracking the converging systems for 6 days before he used the phrase atmospheric bomb in an official NWS briefing document, and he had chosen the word carefully, knowing it would be read and possibly quoted, wanting its connotation of irreversibility and speed to be precisely clear. The Arctic vortex descending from the polar region was not itself unusual. Cold River and the surrounding high plains saw vortex incursions most winters, cold air pushing south along the eastern face of the Rockies. What was unusual was the atmospheric river moving north and east from the Gulf of Mexico, carrying moisture anomalies 3 standard deviations above the seasonal average for the region. When these two systems met over the high-altitude terrain of central Wyoming, the barometric pressure differential would be sufficient to generate pressure gradients associated with the Category 2 hurricane conditions sustained over a land area the size of Connecticut. Klein sat alone in the Cheyenne office at 11:30 on a Thursday night, looking at the collision models for the 4th time. Each run he fed into the ensemble came back with the same result within margins that were professionally uncomfortable in their consistency. He called his supervisor at home. "I need you to look at my screen." He described what he was seeing. There was a silence on the other end, and then, "How confident are you?" Klein looked at the agreement between the independent model runs. "Confident enough that I won't be able to sleep until we get the warning issued." The warning went out the following morning under the NWS's highest categorical designation: catastrophic threat to life and property. Travel will become impossible within 12 hours of onset. Power grid failure is probable. Shelter in place. This is not a normal winter storm. Cold River received the warnings the same way it received most information that arrived from institutions located at a distance, with the particular skepticism of a community that had been surviving its own winters for over 100 years without outside advice. Mayor Douglas Haynes went on KCRV, the local AM station that served the valley that afternoon, and used words like prepared and experienced and not our first rodeo in a tone that carried the implicit suggestion that genuine concern about weather was a trait found primarily in people who had not grown up here. He mentioned that Frank Dolan had extra firewood for sale at the supply store if anyone needed to top off. He mentioned the snow plows were fueled and ready. He did not use the phrase catastrophic threat. Frank was called back for a second segment later that afternoon in his capacity as a longtime resident and community voice, and he gave the reassurance that the station wanted from him with the ease of a man who had never been wrong about this particular thing. "I've seen snow," he said. "We all have. This is Wyoming. Stock up, stay warm, enjoy the weekend." There was laughter in the studio. Frank had a good laugh, big and genuine, and the kind of sound that made people feel collectively included in something comfortable. Eleanor was underground when the broadcast aired, monitoring the barometric pressure readings on her weather instrument and running the preparedness checklist she had written and laminated during the shelter's first operational week. She was not listening to KCRV. She had a battery-powered weather radio tuned to the NWS alert frequency, and she had been listening to Klein's warning cycling on repeat for 3 hours. The language was not ambiguous. The data behind it, which she had accessed through the NWS online dashboard before losing surface connectivity to the satellite receiver, was not ambiguous. Eleanor had spent a professional lifetime reading the behavior of physical systems under extreme load, and what Klein's models described was a physical system about to behave in a way that the built environment of Cold River was not designed to accommodate. She moved her truck into the reinforced garage at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She secured the blast shutters over the cabin's windows. Steel panels that tracked in recessed channels she had installed in the window framing, disguised with cedar trim on the exterior, so they looked like conventional shutters from the road. She checked the seals on the primary hatch, running her hand around the full circumference of the compression gasket, pressing at intervals to feel for any section that had degraded over the winter. She topped off the diesel generator's fuel tank from the secondary storage drum in the generator subchamber. She ran the battery system through a full charge cycle and confirmed all 12 cells at capacity. She checked the CO2 scrubber chemical levels and logged the reading full charge estimated operational duration for one occupant, approximately 720 hours. She was standing at the hatch at 3:45 p.m., one hand on the locking wheel, looking up through the entry stairwell at the narrow rectangle of sky visible at the top. The light had been changing for the past hour, not dimming, not clouding over in the way of an ordinary storm approach, changing in quality, turning the particular color of a bruise that had been aging for 9 days, the same color that had lived in her memory every day for 3 years. Her heart did the thing it always did when the sky looked like that. The dropping sensation, the compression in the sternum, the specific physical language of a body that has learned what certain colors can mean. She recognized it as information without letting it become instruction. She was already inside the shelter before the first gust hit, not running, not panicked, walking at the pace of someone who had thought about this moment for 2 years and had nothing left to improvise. She pulled the hatch down and seated the lock. At 4 p.m., the surface temperature was 32 degrees Fahrenheit. By 5:17 p.m., it had fallen to -18. The storm did not arrive, it detonated. There was no gradual accumulation of snowfall, no building wind that allowed for adjustment or preparation. A wall of white arrived with the totality of a physical barrier, opaque dents moving at velocities that converted snow from precipitation into projectile. The sustained winds across the valley ran at 75 miles per hour with recorded gusts exceeding 90. 5 inches of snowfall per hour buried roads before plows could reach them. The temperature continued falling. By 6 p.m., the surface reading on Eleanor's monitor showed -24 degrees Fahrenheit, and the number was still moving downward. She sat in the geothermal warmth of her shelter and watched the monitors and drank the tea that had gone cold while she was listening at the hatch, and the sound of the storm above her reached her, filtered through 2 feet of earth and concrete as something that was not quite sound anymore. A low, rhythmic vibration that she felt in her chair and her feet, and the hand that rested on the workbench rather than heard through the air. It was, she thought, what it might feel like to be inside something alive. At 6:14 p.m., the lights of Cold River went out. The power lines running the mountain pass had been loading with ice since the storm's onset, their cables accumulating weight faster than the temperature dropped enough to cause clean fracture. When the critical load tolerance was reached, the failure was not gradual. It moved down the transmission line in a cascade that reached the primary substation in 4.2 seconds, and the substation's overload protection failed to engage correctly, and there was a flash of blue-white light visible even through Eleanor's ice-buried exterior cameras, a brief, brilliant illumination that turned the static white of the camera feeds into something almost photographic before returning to nothing. The hatch proximity sensor had been powered continuously since Eleanor installed it, drawing almost no current from the battery bank, its sensitivity threshold set and undisturbed. The red indicator above the security console had not blinked once in 400 days of operation. Eleanor had occasionally wondered in the private inventory of doubts she allowed herself only underground whether she was monitoring something that would never come. Whether the architecture of her caution was elaborate and precise and entirely unnecessary, a monument, Rachel's word, to a probability that would never actualize. The indicator blinked at 11:47 p.m., and Eleanor put down the pressure gauge and walked to the console and pressed her hand against the steel. Human fists, irregular, losing force. She stood there for 90 seconds with her eyes closed and her palm flat against the metal, feeling the irregular percussion of people who had run out of options and were now spending their last physical reserves on the hope that something beneath the frozen ground would answer. She thought about the numbers. She thought about 4 large adult bodies and what they would do to the oxygen consumption curve and the battery discharge rate and the scrubber saturation timeline. She thought about the CO2 reading 680 parts per million, the comfortable baseline she had maintained for herself for months, and what it would become with 5 people breathing in 500 square feet of sealed underground space. She thought about the generator's 72 hours of fuel and what percentage of that would be consumed simply by the geothermal pumps working to rewarm 4 hypothermic bodies. She thought about Daniel, who had been in the outbuilding on an August afternoon trying to secure the doors, and how the interval between the world containing him and the world not containing him had been smaller than a heartbeat, and how she had spent 3 years trying to build something that could survive that kind of interval. She thought about a porch facing east. She reached for the locking wheel with both hands and felt the resistance of the frozen condensation that had gripped the grease threads, the same resistance she had felt during every cold weather test cycle, the mechanism stiff but functional, the hydraulic assist engaged. She threw her body weight against the iron spokes, the way she had practiced boots finding grip on the epoxy floor, and the seal broke with a sharp metallic protest that she felt more than heard. She had intended to open it a fraction of an inch. She had intended to peer into the concrete vestibule and assess what she was dealing with before making a secondary decision. That was the plan, the documented plan she had written in her operational manual during the shelter's first winter. In the event of exterior contact, open primary hatch minimally and assess before full ingress. The negative pressure outside had been building for 6 hours against a sealed container, and it did not wait for her assessment. The hatch went, not violently enough to injure her. The hydraulic assist in the counterweight system she had engineered gave her half a second of resistance before the differential overcame everything, but with sufficient force that the door swung inward and struck the concrete retaining wall with a concussion that rang through the shelter structure like a struck bell. The internal pressure alarm tripped immediately, a piercing tone from the environmental panel, and the world outside the hatch arrived all at once, a vortex of white, a wall of cold so absolute it bypassed sensation and registered directly in the nervous system as damage a sound like standing inside a turbine. Eleanor did not panic. The same mechanism that had allowed her to stand at a drafting table 6 days after Daniel's funeral and produce structurally sound drawings, the override, the compartmentalization, whatever name the grief counselor would have given it, engaged with the totality of a circuit breaker. She moved laterally, not against the door, but with the geometry of it, reading the hinge line and the swing arc and stepping aside so the rebounding force worked in her favor. She got both hands on the steel handle. She activated the hydraulic assist in the closing direction. She leaned her full weight into the pull. 4 shapes came through the door with the snow. They fell across the vestibule threshold and onto the shelter floor in a mass of ice-caked fabric and frozen limbs, coughing, not speaking past the point where speech was available to them. The cold came with them. Eleanor had perhaps 4 seconds before the temperature differential would begin affecting her own systems. She got the hatch. She felt the latch engage in the locking pin seat. The hydraulic system confirmed seal status with a faint mechanical confirmation that she had programmed herself to recognize over every other sound the shelter made. The silence was immediate and complete. She had designed the acoustic isolation deliberately knowing that sound fatigue in an emergency was a real variable, and the transition from the noise of the storm to the shelter's baseline quiet was as sharp as a door closing in a recording studio. What remained was the environmental panel's alarm, which she silenced with a single keystroke, and the sound of 4 people trying to remember how to breathe. She recognized Frank Dolan by his belt. She would not have recognized his face. It was a mask of frost and abraded skin, the color wrong, in ways that the medical part of her mind cataloged rapidly and without sentiment. Peripheral cyanosis in the lips, early signs of facial frostbite on the exposed areas, involuntary muscle rigidity in the jaw that told her the core temperature had been falling long enough to recruit the deeper muscular response. He was the largest body in the group and the most visibly compromised, which made thermodynamic sense: more surface area, more time at the front of whatever formation they had used to get here. Beside him, Cal Briggs was already moving his eyes around the shelter with a mechanic's systematic inventory, taking in the battery bank, the panel lights, the geothermal manifold, the overhead LED strips. His lips were the wrong color, but his consciousness was intact, and Eleanor filed that away. Owen Tate was on his side, teeth producing an audible rhythm against each other, his hands pressed under his armpits in the correct instinctive response. And Jessie Pruitt, 29 years old, the youngest of them, who had spent a day on her cabin roof 2 summers ago, asking her questions about fascia board attachment that revealed he understood his trade properly, was the one she went to first because he was convulsing. The convulsing was actually a positive indicator. It meant the thermoregulatory response was still active. Bodies that had stopped shivering were further gone than bodies that hadn't. She assessed Jessie's arm rapidly and found the source of the blood, a laceration on the left forearm, through the outer layer of his sleeve, not deep enough to have hit anything critical but bleeding freely and making the floor a hazard. She had the medical locker open in 3 strides, pulled a trauma dressing, and had the wound dressed and pressure applied before moving back to Frank. Getting the frozen clothing off four men was a logistics problem, not an emotional one, and Eleanor approached it as such systematically in order of medical priority cutting, where the ice had bonded fabric to itself and the material wouldn't release. Frank attempted to resist when she reached him, and she told him clearly and without softness that his hands were non-functional and his opinion on the matter was therefore not actionable. His jaw was too rigid to form a reply. The Mylar emergency blankets came out of the medical cabinet in their compact fold packets. She cracked four of them open and wrapped each man in the reflective sheeting, then addressed the position problem. They needed to be on the heated floor directly over the radiant grid, not on the cots where there was an air gap between them and the geothermal warmth. She moved them one at a time with the impersonal efficiency of a person who has spent a great deal of time understanding how objects respond to force. The IV saline bags in the medical cabinet were 8 of them, 500 milliliters, each part of a kit she had assembled after completing her Wilderness First Responder certification the previous spring. 80 hours of instruction through a program run out of Jackson Hole that covered everything from spinal immobilization to altitude illness management. The instructor, a former paramedic named Garrett, who had the particular economy of someone whose words had once cost lives if misused, had taught the class about fluid warming as a hypothermia intervention, the axilla and femoral regions as transfer points, the correct temperature range for the warming medium, the rationale for indirect rather than direct heat application. The bags were carried for warming and wound irrigation, not IV administration, a distinction that mattered in the field precisely because it was so often misunderstood. Eleanor had asked the instructor 3 follow-up questions after class that had made him look at her with the expression of someone recalibrating an assumption. She ran the electric kettle, still operational, the battery bank holding steady at 91%, and submerged the saline bags until her instant read thermometer confirmed 105 degrees Fahrenheit, then placed 2 bags per person in the correct anatomical positions. Cal, who was conscious enough to watch her work, tracked the procedure with visible attention. When she reached him, she saw the question forming before he asked it. WFR training, she said before he could speak. Warming packs and wound irrigation, not IV administration. He looked at the bag under his arm and then at the placement rationale and nodded once, the nod of someone who has understood the engineering logic rather than simply accepted the instruction. The next 4 hours were what they were. There is a category of medical experience that no preparation fully accounts for, not the procedure itself, which Eleanor had trained for, but the sound of it. The sound of the nervous system reasserting itself through damaged tissue. Jesse wept with his swollen fingers pressed against his chest, not from fear, but from the specific neurological pain of sensation, returning to extremities that had begun to go quiet. Owen made sounds that were not language. Frank was silent, which Eleanor monitored more carefully than the others, because silence in a hypothermia patient can indicate depth of compromise rather than resilience. She checked his pulse every 20 minutes. It remained present and slowly strengthening. Cal, lying under his mylar blanket with his eyes open, spoke eventually. How long was the warming designed for? She understood he meant the radiant floor system. The geothermal loop is continuous, she told him. It doesn't deplete. He was quiet for a moment. What does deplete? She looked at him. He was asking the right question. Everything else, she said. Around midnight, Frank's voice returned. Not his voice as she knew it from the hardware counter and the radio broadcast. That voice was a performance calibrated for an audience. This was the voice underneath, roughened without architecture. He was looking at the ceiling with the focus of someone who has recently understood something that cannot be reversed. My windows, he said, not as explanation or complaint, but as statement of fact, the way a person names something that has passed from the category of possession into the category of event. The glass. He stopped. It didn't break. It came in. He looked at the poured concrete above him. It came in all at once. Drink. Eleanor held a thermos of warm, heavily sugared tea against his mouth. Not because the conversation wasn't interesting to her. In some ways she wouldn't have admitted, but because the calories were more immediately relevant than the processing of trauma. Sip, don't gulp. Owen spoke from the floor on his other side, his voice still carrying the tremor, but controlled now, willful rather than involuntary. We followed your fence. He paused to let another wave of shivering pass. Frank knew where it was. He said it was the paranoid fence. He said we should follow it and it would lead us here. He looked at Eleanor. He was right. Eleanor checked the readout on the main power conduit. Battery status 87%, consumption rate elevated. She was already running the numbers that she would spend the rest of the night confirming the arithmetic of what 5 bodies in a space built for one would do to every system she had designed with a single occupant's load in mind. The oxygen curves, the CO2 saturation timeline, the thermal demand on the geothermal system, and what that meant for the pump electricity consumption, and what that meant for the battery bank, and what that meant for the generator, and how many hours of generator fuel stood between the people on her floor and the thing that would happen when the power stopped. She was not afraid of the numbers. Numbers were honest in a way that almost nothing else was. The numbers told her what the problem was, and the problem once identified was addressable, or it wasn't, and if it wasn't, you simply knew that earlier rather than later, which was always preferable. She pulled her operational notebook from the shelf above the workbench and opened it to a fresh page and began to write. Outside, the storm continued its work on the world above her, methodical and indifferent, burying. Cold River under a sustained rage that Klein's models had predicted would last for another 60 hours. The surface temperature on her monitor read negative 31 degrees Fahrenheit at 1 a.m. and was still falling. The barometric pressure was lower than any reading she had recorded in 2 winters of operation. The intake fans were running at elevated speed against a resistance profile that told her the snow was piling against the stump, housing not blocking yet, the flow rate still adequate but pressing. She noted the time in the reading and turned the page and kept writing. Against the far wall, Frank Dolan lay on the heated concrete floor of a shelter he had mocked for 2 years alive, inside a precision that had never needed his belief to function, and looked at the ceiling and said nothing more for a long time. The notebook filled 3 pages by 3 a.m., and none of what Eleanor wrote was comfortable reading. She had built the shelter's resource calculations on a single occupant because that was the only variable she had controlled for, and controlled variables were the foundation of useful engineering. 1 adult female resting metabolism, minimal exertion, ambient temperature, maintained at 62 degrees Fahrenheit by the geothermal system. Against that baseline, she had run every system to its theoretical limit and confirmed redundancies at each failure point. The result was a structure that could sustain one person through conditions that would kill the surrounding landscape for a duration measured in weeks rather than days. She had been proud of that. In the private way she allowed herself pride, not as performance, but as professional confirmation that the work was sound. What she was writing now was not pride. It was triage of a different kind. 5 people breathe. 5 people exhale carbon dioxide at a combined rate that her NBC filtration system scrubber bank had not been specified to handle. The chemical scrubber's lithium hydroxide canisters arranged in a recirculation manifold operated on a first-order consumption curve. Their capacity to absorb CO2 was fixed, their depletion rate proportional to the concentration of CO2 being presented to them. At one person's respiratory output, the canisters would last approximately 720 hours before reaching chemical saturation. At 5 people's output, the same canisters faced a load that compressed the saturation timeline to something in the range of 96 hours from the current moment, assuming the surface intake remained functional to supplement the scrubber's work. The surface intake remained the variable she trusted least, and its vulnerability was not theoretical. The intake pipe stump housing rose 2 feet above the original grade. The snow accumulation around it calculated from the deposition rate, and the hours elapsed since storm onset was already in excess of 3 feet. When wind-driven snow packed into the hollow of the stump housing, and the temperature dropped below a threshold that allowed partial melt-refreeze cycling, the intake path could become blocked by a plug of ice dense enough that the fans would not clear it under power. She had tested the fans against snow loading in 2 previous winters, and they had handled it. She had not tested them against the combination of sustained high-wind loading and the temperature conditions Klein's model had generated. She wrote the intake blockage scenario in the right margin of the 3rd page and put a box around it. 12 hours of adequate airflow remaining if the intake blocked tonight. After that, the scrubbers alone. After the scrubbers saturated CO2 to accumulation at a rate governed by 5 pairs of lungs in a sealed 500 square foot space. The curve from saturation to incapacitation was not a long one. She closed the notebook and looked at the 4 men on her floor. Frank was asleep, finally his chest rising and falling, in the slow cadence of someone whose body had prioritized shutdown after the acute crisis passed. The color had returned to his face in gradations over the past 2 hours. The deep cyanosis around his lips had softened to something merely pale. The frost burns on his cheeks now showing the angry pink of tissue that had been near the edge and pulled back. His breathing had a slightly labored quality. She was monitoring not the shallow flutter of someone in respiratory distress, but the careful, measured respiration of a large man managing pain he was too proud to name. She had noted the way he held himself when he shifted position, the subtle bracing of his right arm, the controlled exhale when his torso rotated. She filed the observation without conclusion because she had no imaging capability, and palpation of a hypothermia patient in the acute phase told you only so much. Cal was not asleep. He was lying on his back under the mylar blanket with his eyes open, and when Eleanor returned to the workbench, he tracked the movement with the peripheral attention of someone who had been awake and thinking for a while. The warming had worked on him faster than the others. His body mass distribution was different from Frank's, leaner and more efficiently metabolic, and his core temperature had dropped less during the crossing because he had, Eleanor inferred from the positioning of the group, when they fell through the door, been at the rear of the formation rather than the front, protected by the bodies ahead of him from the worst of the wind loading. He was intact. He was paying attention. These were resources she mentally noted. Owen had finally stopped shivering around 2:30 a.m., the thermoregulatory response winding down as his core temperature stabilized. He lay on his side facing the wall, and Eleanor had checked his pulse twice since the shivering stopped to confirm the stabilization was genuine, rather than a sign that the thermoregulatory response had exhausted itself. His pulse was steady and strengthening. He was not asleep so much as suspended, the particular inward state of someone who has recently experienced something that the processing faculties haven't finished categorizing. Jesse had cried himself into a shallow sleep around midnight, his swollen hands cradled against his chest, his breathing the irregular rhythm of someone who drops off from exhaustion and keeps startling themselves back to the surface. His forearm wound had not bled through the dressing. He would have bruising and superficial frostbite on the exposed skin of his face and hands, and the finger blistering would be uncomfortable for days. But nothing Eleanor had assessed suggested he had sustained lasting tissue damage. At 3:47 a.m., Cal spoke. "What's the number that worries you most?" His voice was low enough not to disturb the others and the directness of the question. No preamble, no social scaffolding, told Eleanor that he had been working through his own analysis of the situation and had arrived at the same general architecture of concern without the benefit of her instrumentation. Eleanor considered whether there was a reason not to answer honestly. She could find no structural argument for concealment. "The air," she said, "the intake pipe serves the scrubbers. If it blocks with ice, we're on the scrubbers alone, and the scrubbers weren't specified for 5 people. Cal was quiet for a moment. "How long?" She gave him the number. He received it the way a mechanic receives a compression reading, not with alarm, but with the focused attention of someone converting information into a problem set. "And the fans can't clear a blocked intake. Not if the ice sets." The fans were rated against snow loading. Ice is a different material. Cal looked at the ceiling. So someone has to go up and clear it manually if it blocks. It was not a question. Eleanor nodded once. If it blocks. The word hung in the shelter's quiet for a moment, and then Cal closed his eyes and Eleanor turned back to her panel, and the instruments continued their patient reporting of the world's condition. The storm did not moderate through the night. The barometric pressure readings, which Eleanor logged every 30 minutes with the consistency of someone who understood that data collected at irregular intervals was less useful than data collected badly, showed no upward movement. The surface wind speed transmitter reported sustained velocities between 72 and 88 miles per hour throughout the overnight hours, with episodic gusts that exceeded the sensor's upper calibration limit and were logged simply as over range. The temperature continued its descent until 4:30 a.m. when it reached negative 34 degrees Fahrenheit and held, not rising, holding at the bottom of a range that made the outside world something that existed only in numbers on a screen. The day that followed the first full day underground with 5 people in a space built for one established the rhythms that would govern the group for what came next. Eleanor maintained the monitoring schedule. She made hot food from the freeze-dried stores at intervals that corresponded to medical need rather than social convention. High-calorie, high-sodium broth and rehydrated grain at 6 a.m., a more substantial meal at noon, another at 6 p.m. She offered these without discussion of preference or alternatives. And nobody argued with the system, partly because nobody had the energy to argue, and partly because the logic was self-evident once you were operating in a space where caloric accounting was as consequential as any other form. Frank woke at 7 a.m. and lay still for several minutes before moving, and Eleanor watched him take inventory of himself, the small test motions of someone assessing damage before committing to full function. When he finally sat up the way he managed, the transition told her what she had suspected about his ribs. He was protecting something on his right side, keeping the torso rotation minimal, using his left arm for support while his right stayed close to his body. She brought him the broth and sat across from him and watched him drink it. Right side, she said. It wasn't a question. Frank looked at her over the rim of the thermos. It's manageable. I need to assess it. He set the thermos down and she ran her hands along the rib cage with the methodical pressure of her WFR training, and he breathed carefully and said nothing while she worked. And when she found the 2 sites of point tenderness, she pressed gently and felt the crepitus that confirmed what she had already cataloged: fractures non-displaced, the lung fields clear on both sides when she put her ear against his back and listened to his breathing. 2 ribs, she told him, non-displaced. Your lungs are clear. You'll need to breathe carefully and not put lateral load on that side. Frank looked at the wall for a moment. I've had worse. She didn't argue the point because it wasn't relevant. She wrapped his chest with the elastic bandage from the trauma kit and told him not to cough unless he had to, and moved on. What Eleanor discovered over the course of that first full day was that the group, absent the extremity of the acute medical crisis that had occupied her completely for the previous 6 hours, had personalities that were going to operate in a closed system, whether she managed them or not. Frank's booming authority was muted, not gone, but operating at reduced amplitude like a transmitter, running on backup power. He sat with his back against the wall near the dry goods shelving and received the situation with a heaviness that was not simply physical. Owen had found his small notebook in the inside pocket of the jacket Eleanor had stacked with the other dry gear, and he held it without opening it, turning it in his hands with the consideration of someone deciding whether they have anything worth writing. Jesse slept and woke and slept again in the cycling pattern of a body that had not finished recovering. And when he was awake, he was quiet in a way that was different from Cal's quiet, not contemplative but provisional, as though he were checking something internal at regular intervals and hadn't yet decided on the result. Cal helped Eleanor, not intrusively, not with the excessive helpfulness of someone performing contrition or seeking favor. He simply identified tasks that needed doing and did them, topping off the water reserve from the storage tank's manual pump when the level indicator showed it was drawing down, cleaning the cooking equipment after meals with the conserved water method Eleanor had written into her operational manual and posted on the wall, checking the battery readouts at intervals and recording them in the logs she had established for the purpose. When he didn't know the procedure, he asked once specifically, and then he didn't need to be told again. Eleanor found herself adjusting to the presence of someone who understood that function was its own form of respect and who expressed it without commentary. The CO2 reading on the morning of the second day in shelter had climbed to 1,200 parts per million. The baseline for outdoor air was approximately 420. The level at which cognitive effects began to manifest in most people, subtle, slowing, mild headache, the first edges of irritability, was around 1,500. The level at which Eleanor's alarm would trigger was 1,800, the threshold she had set based on OSHA and NWS guidelines during the shelter's design phase. The scrubbers were working. The intake was still functional. But the trend line on her log told a story that didn't require interpretation. They were moving steadily in one direction, and the rate was consistent with her worst-case projection. She did not share the trending data with the group on the second day. There was nothing actionable in it yet, and the arithmetic of air quality in a closed system was the kind of information that produced either productive problem-solving or counterproductive anxiety, depending on the recipient, and she was still assessing which of those outcomes each person in the shelter was capable of. What she did do was establish a rule about physical activity: calm movement only, no exertion, framed as a thermal conservation measure rather than an oxygen management strategy, because the distinction was irrelevant to the behavioral outcome, and one explanation created less psychological pressure than the other. Frank accepted the explanation without interest. Owen looked at her when she said it with the particular expression of a person who suspects they are being given a simplified version of a more complex truth and has decided to trust the source rather than demand the complication. Jessie was asleep. Cal caught her eye briefly and then looked away, which was as close to a private acknowledgement as either of them had exchanged in 2 days. It was on the second night that Frank talked about Tommy Reeves and Mike Sauer. The shelter was dark except for the blue-green glow of the environmental panel and the amber standby light on the generator subchamber door. Eleanor was at the workbench with a headlamp making entries in her log. The others were on the cots or the floor in the suspended state that passed for sleep when real sleep wasn't available. Frank's voice came from the far side of the room without preamble, the way a sound sometimes arrives in a quiet space and seems to have been there for a while before you notice it. I invited 2 more people for that poker game. He paused, and the pause had weight. Tommy Reeves owns the feed supply in Route 12, and Mike Sauer, his kid Jake, was supposed to come with him. Another pause. They said no. Tommy had a thing with his wife. Mike said Jake had homework. Frank's breathing shifted slightly, the careful management of a man with broken ribs trying to speak at length. I told Tommy last week that the forecast was fear-mongering. I said that to his face. Owen was awake. The quality of silence from his direction was the silence of a person who has heard something and is processing it rather than sleeping through it. Frank did not ask for absolution. That was the thing about it. He wasn't confessing toward an expected response. He was simply accounting in the dark for the mathematics of his influence, for the specific geometry of how his certainty had propagated outward and landed in other people's decisions. Tommy Reeves was in his house on Route 12 right now. Mike Sauer and his son Jake were somewhere in Cold River. None of them had been in Frank's A-frame when the glass came in. Frank had made that outcome possible with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about snow, and now he was lying on Eleanor's concrete floor in the dark, running that knowledge through whatever accounting system he used for things that couldn't be undone. Eleanor did not look up from her log. She thought about the daisy chain of influence that led from a man's bravado on a radio broadcast to the specific content of a feed store owner's decision-making during a storm warning. She had no words that would improve the situation. She logged the 2 AM CO2, reading 1,540 parts per million. above the cognitive effect threshold below the alarm and noted it without comment. The alarm triggered at 6:14 a.m. on the third day in shelter. The sound was a two-tone chirp, the medium urgency indicator she had programmed for readings between 1,800 and 2,500 parts per million, and it woke everyone who was asleep with the undiscriminating efficiency of a sound designed to penetrate sleep. Eleanor was already at the panel, CO2 1847, external intake status restricted. The fan speed indicator showed the motors running at full capacity against a resistance load that had climbed significantly overnight. The intake was not blocked, but something was pressing against it from outside, reducing the airflow to approximately 60% of normal operating volume. She increased the fan speed override to maximum and watched the intake flow indicator. It improved marginally and then stabilized at roughly 65%. She ran the reversal cycle, a brief counter rotation of the fan array designed to blow debris back out of the intake path, and heard the mechanical pulse travel through the ductwork. The flow indicator improved to 70%, held for 90 seconds, then dropped back to 65. Ice. Cal had moved to stand beside her without her hearing him approach, which was a measure of how much of her attention was on the panel. Partial, she said. The fan reversal recovered some of it. If the temperature stays down, it'll consolidate overnight. Cal looked at the flow rate. What's the threshold? She pointed to the number on the panel. At 50% intake and 5 people, the scrubbers can't maintain below 2,000. At 30%, they lose the battle completely. Cal straightened. He didn't say anything, but he looked at the panel with the expression of a man who has just confirmed the mileage reading he was hoping was wrong. The third day was harder than the first two in the specific way that continuation is harder than onset. The acute crisis of the first night had given the group a common external focus, something to orient against. The second day had been recovery, which had its own trajectory and demanded its own attention. The third day was just time. 5 people in 500 square feet with thinning air and no external horizon, and nothing to do but wait for a storm that had no interest in their timeline. Jesse was the first to show it. He had been moving through the shelter with increasing restlessness since noon, not pacing exactly, but circulating, finding reasons to go from one end of the space to the other, and back, a pattern that Eleanor recognized as the physical expression of a mind trying to outrun something that lived inside it rather than outside. By mid-afternoon, he had begun stopping near the quarter walls, pressing his palms flat against the concrete, testing the boundary of something inside. He was counting the walls. Owen saw it too. He closed the notebook he had finally opened and begun writing in, and stood up with the unhurried movement of a man who has decided something, and walked to where Jesse was standing with his back against the east wall and his eyes doing the arithmetic of the room. Owen sat down on the floor nearby, not next to Jesse, not crowding the space, just present in it, and said, "The roof on this place, you put it on." Jesse looked at him. "Cedar shake. I did it 2 summers ago." Owen's voice was the voice he used in a classroom, not artificially warm, but genuinely interested, carrying the weight of a question that expects a real answer. "She have you do anything different from standard?" Jesse was quiet for a moment, and something in the physical quality of his stillness changed. The circling in his eyes slowed. "The overlap," he said. "She wanted the overlap thicker than code requires. I had to order extra material." Owen waited. Jesse looked up at the ceiling of the shelter, the real ceiling, now not the one in his head, and something seemed to locate itself. "She said she wanted the water to have nowhere to go but off the edge." His breathing was different. It was slower. Owen didn't push beyond that. He simply stayed there, sitting on Eleanor's concrete floor, and opened his notebook again and began to write, and Jesse stayed against the wall but stopped counting it, and the particular quality of pressure in his chest eased into something less urgent. Frank, watching from his position near the dry goods shelving, said nothing. He was watching Owen with an expression Eleanor had not seen on his face before, not the evaluative look of a man assessing someone's performance, but something more like recognition. The look of someone seeing a skill they hadn't known was a skill until they watched it practiced. The fourth day brought the headaches. They were diffused, not localized, the characteristic pressure of hypercapnia, rather than the temporal focus pain of dehydration or stress. Eleanor had been recording the CO2 readings every 2 hours, and the trend was consistent: 1,847 on the morning of day 3, 2,100 by evening, 2,340 by the morning of day 4. The intake was holding at 65%, which was not enough to offset the respiratory load of 5 people in a sealed space. The scrubbers were performing at specification, but the specification had never anticipated this application. She issued the activity restriction on the morning of day 4. Minimal movement, conserve breathing, no unnecessary speech. Frank received this with a nod that acknowledged it was not in fact about thermal conservation. Owen received it with the quiet trust of someone who had decided to extend credit without requiring full disclosure. Jesse, whose spatial anxiety had settled into a manageable background condition since Owen's intervention, pulled his knees to his chest on his cot and breathed with deliberate slowness. Cal sat on the floor near the environmental panel and logged the readings with the regularity Eleanor had established, and she let him do it because his accuracy was precise and his handwriting was legible, and because having someone share the monitoring was, she admitted to herself in the private inventory, a relief she hadn't anticipated needing. The afternoon of day 4 was when Owen told her about Denver. He had moved to sit near the workbench while Eleanor was checking the geothermal pump pressure readings, and he began talking in the tone of a man who has decided that the circumstances justify a certain dispensation with social filtering. His wife had taken the children to Denver 18 months ago, not a separation or not officially, but a renegotiation of geography that had hardened by degrees into something that had the shape of permanence without carrying its name. She had wanted him to come. He had reasons he had given her for staying in Cold River that were technically true and constitutively insufficient, and he had known the difference while he was giving them. The real reason, which he said with the flat affect of a man articulating something he has thought about long enough, that the emotion has been incorporated into the structure of the thought, was that he was a person of consequence in Cold River. He had taught the children of people who had taught him. He was known in the specific, particular way that a person can only be known in a place with a long memory for people. In Denver, he would be a man who had arrived somewhere in his 50s and had not yet accumulated the weight of being remembered. Eleanor ran the pump pressure check without interrupting him. When he finished, she did not perform the response he was perhaps offering, the space for the validation, the reframing, the well-intentioned softening that would have turned his statement into something more comfortable. "You're teaching kids that decisions have consequences," she said, "historical ones. You said that yourself, so you already have the answer." She heard him turn that over. Then she heard the sound of his pen moving on the page of his notebook, which was the only response she needed. The CO2 alarm on the morning of the 5th day was different from the one on day 3. It was not the two-tone chirp of the medium threshold. It was the continuous tone of the critical alarm, the one she had programmed for above 3,500 parts per million, and had hoped with the private hope of an engineer who doesn't fully believe their own worst-case scenarios never to hear. The sound filled the shelter's acoustic isolation like something physical, and it pulled everyone upright at once with the physiological authority of a sound that the body understands before the mind catches up. Eleanor silenced it and turned to the panel. CO2 3,847 parts per million. External intake blocked. The intake flow indicator read 0. The fan motors were running at full speed against a load that was not yielding. The fans had been winning partially for 2 days, and overnight the ice had set consolidating from partially blocked to fully sealed, and the reversal cycle she ran 3 consecutive times produced no improvement in the flow indicator. She stood at the panel for a moment with the information fully in her possession, assembling the secondary calculations that the primary reading required. At 3,847 parts per million with 0 intake, and 5 people continuing to exhale. The CO2 curve was now running steeply uninterruptible by anything short of physical intervention at the surface. The scrubber's remaining chemical capacity would moderate the climb for a few hours, not stop it. In approximately 12 hours, the concentration would reach levels that would induce loss of consciousness. 2 to 3 hours after that, it would reach levels from which consciousness does not recover. She pulled the canvas duffel from beneath her cot and unzipped it on the workbench. The thermal isolation suit was a one-piece unit she had sourced from an industrial safety supplier in Idaho, rated for 20 minutes of core temperature protection at negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, designed for emergency maintenance work on cold process industrial equipment. Beside it, the SCBA unit, the self-contained breathing apparatus she had acquired from a retired firefighter and lander, for the same reason she had acquired almost everything else in this shelter, which was that she had identified a scenario in which she would need it and had resolved the need before it became an emergency. On the workbench beside them, a steel pry bar and a propane blowtorch. Frank was already standing. I go. There was no deliberation in it, no visible weighing of alternatives, no social performance of reluctance overcome by duty. He had been sitting with something since the night he talked about Tommy Reeves and the quality of his movement. Now was the quality of a man for whom the answer to a question has been available for days, and the question has finally been asked in the right form. Cal started to speak. Frank turned towards him with a steadiness that had nothing aggressive in it and everything final. Cal. One word. Cal stopped. Frank looked around the room at Owen, who had his notebook closed in his lap and his eyes steady, at Jesse, who was sitting with his hands over his mouth watching, at Eleanor, who was holding the thermal suit in both hands and had not yet decided anything about the expression on her face. I invited them here. The glass was mine. The calculation that it would hold was mine. He looked at Eleanor with a directness that was different from the directness of a man used to being right. I go. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She considered the physical variables, his rib injury, the controlled breathing discipline that the SCBA mask would enforce regardless the pry bar work requiring torso rotation. The fractures were non-displaced, confirmed 3 days ago. The SCBA would enforce slow measured breathing mechanics that were paradoxically exactly what fractured ribs required. The pry bar work would stress the injury, but Frank Dolan had been moving heavy materials in physical environments his entire adult life, and his upper body strength, even compromised, exceeded what any other available option could bring to the problem of excavating through 4 to 5 feet of consolidated ice and snow with a manual tool. The variables assessed without sentiment pointed to the same conclusion Frank had already reached. She held out the thermal suit. She walked him through the procedure with the precision of a mission briefing, because that was what it was. The vestibule would function as an airlock. She would seal the inner hatch behind him. He would open the outer hatch, which would admit whatever the storm had left against it. He would excavate upward through the snowpack, straight up, following the north-northwest compass heading she marked on the inside of his wrist with a grease pencil 14 feet to the intake stump. He would use the pry bar to break any consolidated ice around, and in the stump housing, then the torch to melt and clear the intake pipe itself. He would return to the vestibule in 25 minutes. If he was not in the vestibule with the outer hatch sealed in 25 minutes, she would not open the inner hatch. The shelter's survival and the survival of everyone in it depended on the inner hatch remaining sealed if the outer hatch was open and unoccupied. Frank listened to all of it. And if I can't make it back in time? Eleanor looked at him without flinching. Then you've cleared the intake, and the people in here will be breathing again, and you'll have done what you set out to do. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then something crossed his face that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else Eleanor had a name for. Fair enough, his voice low, carrying the weight of a man who has made peace with an outcome he would prefer to survive. Cal helped Eleanor get the thermal suit sealed over Frank's bulk, the chest wrap adding a layer of complication that they worked around together. Owen held the SCBA unit while Eleanor ran through the breathing apparatus check regulator flow rate, mask seal tank pressure. Jesse was on his feet, not pacing, watching. The CO2 reading on the panel behind them had climbed to 3,960 by the time the suit was sealed. Eleanor cycled the inner hatch. Frank stepped into the vestibule's cold concrete dark, and she heard him take one controlled breath through the mask regulator, the sound of it amplified by the SCBA's mechanics. She pulled the inner hatch closed and set the locks. She turned to the monitor. The vestibule camera was a low-lux unit she had installed for precisely this scenario to maintain visual contact with the airlock during emergency egress procedures. It fed to the security console in grainy infrared green, and it showed Frank standing in front of the outer hatch with the pry bar in his right hand and the torch in his left, his thermal suit's reflective material catching the IR illumination and returning it in fragments. He engaged the outer hatch's hydraulic levers. What came in when the outer hatch opened was not the interior of the vestibule anymore. It was a wall-white, densely packed, the accumulated product of 5 days of snowfall and wind compaction, filling the opening completely from bottom to top, the kind of snow that has been sitting under its own weight long enough to develop the structural coherence of low-grade concrete. Frank hit it with the pry bar before the outer hatch had finished its arc vertical strokes, driving into the face of the pack, and Eleanor watched him work through the grainy green feed with the attention of someone who understands that what she is watching is the primary variable in her survival equation. Cal stood beside her. Owen stood behind them. Jesse had moved to where he could see the monitor without crowding the console. The CO2 reading climbed at 4020. The shelter's air had the physical quality of a room that has been occupied too long, not unbreathable, not yet, but thick and stale, in a way that the body registered as a low continuous warning. Minute 7, Frank had penetrated approximately 2 feet into the snowpack, carving a vertical channel barely wide enough for his suited body. He was moving steadily, not frantically, which was correct exertion inside the SCB. Was a tank management problem as much as a physical one. And the controlled pace told Eleanor that Frank understood this even if he'd never been briefed on it. Minute 10, he was into his shoulders, the channel extending up and northward. The infrared camera lost his full form and showed only the reflected heat signature of his suit against the packed white. Minute 13, the signature was gone from the camera's range entirely. He was in the tunnel, CO24180. Jesse sat down on the floor, not collapsing, choosing to sit, conserving understanding without being told that the air was now a commodity that spent itself with every unnecessary breath. Owen sat beside him. Cal remained standing, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes on the panel. Minute 17, nothing from the camera. Minute 20. Eleanor's vision produced a faint shimmer at the periphery, the characteristic edge blur of hypercapnia beginning the visual cortex, the first thing to register the CO2 load as a processing anomaly. She noted it without acting on it because there was nothing to act on. CO24290. Minute 22, Carol said nothing, but Eleanor felt him shift beside her, and the shift had a quality she recognized as someone preparing themselves for a number of different possible outcomes. Minute 24, Eleanor stepped to the inner hatch. She put both hands on the locking wheel, not turning it, holding it. The agreement she had made with Frank in the vestibule was not a performance. It was the structural fact of the situation, as load-bearing as any element in the shelter's design. The shelter had 5 people in it. The hatch was the seal between those 5 people and the conditions outside. If the outer hatch was standing open, and Frank was not in the vestibule to seal it behind him, opening the inner hatch was the end of everyone inside. She stood with her hands on the wheel and the clock running, and the CO2 climbing and the monitor showing her nothing but static white. At 24 minutes and 50 seconds, something happened in the ventilation ductwork. It was not a sound. It was a change in pressure, a subtle equalization, a relaxation in the air column that the shelter's internal atmosphere had been straining against for the past 18 hours. And then it was a sound, the high mechanical whine of the intake fans suddenly spinning without resistance, their RPM climbing instantly from the labored low-frequency grinding of a motor, pushing against a blocked path, to the clean, high-pitched frequency of a system running free. Cold air, real outdoor air below zero and laden with the sharp mineral clarity of Wyoming winter at altitude poured from the ceiling vents. The CO2 reading 4,290, then 4,180, then 4,020 and falling. Jesse made a sound that was not a word. Owen put his hand over his mouth. Cal closed his eyes for 3 seconds. Eleanor did not move her hands from the locking wheel. Minute 26, the vestibule camera feed showed White the tunnel collapse that she had anticipated as a high-probability event the moment Frank disappeared into the snowpack. Then through the White, a thermal signature. Then 2 hands on the outer hatch lever. The hatch swung closed. The indicator on Eleanor's panel shifted to sealed. She turned the wheel. Frank came through the inner hatch with the controlled fall of a man who was choosing to go down rather than being taken down one knee, then both hands, then a slow, deliberate extension onto his back on the shelter floor. The thermal suit was coated in a layer of ice from collar to boot. He reached up and pulled the SCBA mask free from the seal with both hands, and the breath that he took without the regulator was not a gasp. It was the breath of a man who has done something he set out to do and is taking a moment with the result. Intake is clear. The words came out with a careful economy that suggested his ribs were reminding him of their condition. He smiled anyway, the bruised and split-lipped smile of someone operating at the outer limit of what their body is currently capable of and finding it sufficient. Eleanor assessed him in the time it took her to cross the room. The tear in the thermal suit on the right side was not large, but it was recent, and beneath it the underlayer was darkly wet. She knelt beside him without asking permission and peeled back the torn section. A piece of rebar reinforcing steel from the old fence post anchoring system, buried in the compacted snow along the north property line, had caught the suit during the tunnel collapse and scored the underlying clothing and the skin beneath it. The laceration was superficial in the strict medical sense. It had not compromised anything structural. What it had done was deliver a significant impact to the rib cage on the same side as the existing fractures, and when she ran her hands over the site, Frank's carefully maintained silence became a sound she could hear through the contact rather than through the air. "Still 2, she said. "The same 2. Nothing moved." Frank received this assessment with the expression of a man who has decided that information about his own damage is secondary to the completion of an operation. Eleanor applied a fresh dressing to the laceration and reinforced the chest wrap, and Frank lay on the shelter floor under the clean cold air pouring from the ceiling vents and did not say anything more for a long while. On the environmental panel, the CO2 reading continued its descent, 3,600, 3,200, 2,800. The scrubbers, still chemically active, were now receiving supplemental help from the outdoor air cycling through the intake system. The curve that had been pointing one direction for the past 3 days had reversed. The numbers were moving the right way. Eleanor stood at the panel and watched them move. The CO2 reading touched 2,400 parts per million at 9 p.m. on the 5th day, and held there the intake and the scrubbers working in the uneasy partnership of 2 systems that had both been pushed past their design parameters and were now performing at the intersection of their remaining capacity. Eleanor logged the number and did not celebrate it. Stabilization was not recovery. The intake pipe was clear, but the conditions that had blocked it once had not changed. The temperature outside was still negative. 28, the wind was still moving at velocities that compacted fresh snow into the structural consistency of packed earth, and the stump housing was accumulating new material at the same rate it always had. What Frank had bought them with his 25 minutes in the dark was time. How much time depended on variables Eleanor could monitor but not control. She sat with that for a while, which was as close as she came to rest. Frank was asleep by 10 o'clock. His breathing audible across the shelter in the specific, careful rhythm of a man managing pain during unconsciousness, Shorter cycles than normal sleep with a slight hesitation at the top of each inhale where the injured ribs registered their objection and his body accommodated it without waking him. Eleanor had given him ibuprofen at the maximum recommended interval and told him not to lie on his right side, and he had nodded and been asleep within minutes, which told her that whatever reserve he had been running on for the past several hours had fully depleted. She checked his pulse twice in the night and found it steady both times. The sixth day arrived not as a morning. There was no morning underground, no shift in ambient light to mark the transition, but as a change in the character of the sounds coming through the concrete. The vibration that had been constant for 5 days changed its texture sometime around 4 a.m. Not stopped, changed. The gusts that had been irregular and percussive began arriving at longer intervals, and the sustained bass frequency dropped by what she estimated was 15 to 20%. She noted it in the log without drawing a conclusion, because meteorological hope was not a variable she had built into her operational framework, and she was not going to start. The weather radio cycled its update at 5 a.m. with a recording that was 18 minutes old by the time it reached her. Dr. Klein's voice was different from the recording she had been hearing for 5 days. The clinical precision was still there, the careful construction of language designed to be accurately understood rather than emotionally reassuring. But something underneath it had shifted the compressed quality of a man who has been delivering the same catastrophic forecast for days and is now delivering something different. The atmospheric bomb that had stalled over the cold river valley was beginning finally to move. Pressure gradient recovery was underway. The NWS was forecasting a transition from severe to moderate conditions within the next 12 to 18 hours, with a full cessation of snowfall expected before dawn the following day. Travel would remain impossible for at least 48 hours after the storm's passage due to accumulated snow depths. Eleanor turned the volume down and sat with what she had heard. 12 to 18 hours was not over. 12 to 18 hours was still a night and most of a day, and the intake was still the intake, and the scrubbers were still running at a deficit, and Frank's ribs were still fractured, and the battery bank was at 34% and declining toward the threshold at which the diesel generator would need to engage. She had been running the generator in 2-hour intervals since the morning of day 4 to relieve the battery load, and the fuel gauge showed 41% of the original supply remaining. Enough. Marginally enough if the storm ended when Klein's revised forecast predicted, and the solar array could begin contributing again within a day of surface clearance. She wrote the numbers down. They were still a problem, but they were a smaller problem than they had been at midnight, and smaller was the direction she was working in. Cal was awake when she finished the entry, sitting on his cot with his back against the wall and his hands loose in his lap. He looked at her when she put the pen down, and the look had a question in it that he hadn't decided whether to ask. She waited. "When this is over," he said, and then paused as though the sentence's continuation required more precision than the opening suggested. "What do you do with this place?" Eleanor looked at him. It was not the question she had been expecting, and she found she did not have an answer ready, which was unusual for her. "I don't know," she said, which was also unusual and true. The 6th day was the longest day, not in duration every day. Underground ran exactly 24 hours, regardless of what was happening in it, but in texture. The acute emergencies had passed. Frank was healing. The air was breathable. The power was holding. What remained was the specific psychological weight of confinement without crisis. 5 people in a space that had never been designed for habitation beyond the singular filling the hours, with the ordinary human activities of eating and sleeping and talking, and finding that those activities took on a different specific gravity when conducted beneath a storm that was finally beginning to exhaust itself. Owen opened his notebook with a different quality of intention on the morning of day 6, not the hesitant handling of a man who isn't sure he has anything worth committing to the page, but the directness of someone who has made a decision and is now executing it. He wrote for 2 hours without stopping, the pen moving faster and less self-consciously as the morning wore on. Eleanor noticed because she noticed everything in a sealed environment, and she noticed specifically that Owen Tate processed experience through language the way she processed it through calculation, as a primary mechanism, not a secondary one. The thing the mind reached for first when it needed to understand what had happened to it. Jesse ate his full meal at breakfast for the first time since the first night, which Eleanor noted in the medical section of her log as a clinical positive appetite, returning consistent with the expected resolution timeline for mild hypothermia and the psychological stabilization that followed the CO2 crisis. He helped Cal with the morning equipment check without being asked, and Eleanor watched him run the battery readout procedure that Cal had taught him the previous day, with the concentration of someone who has decided that knowing how something works is preferable to not knowing. Frank contributed to the 6 days texture in a way Eleanor had not predicted. He talked not the performance talking of a man working an audience, but the straight accounting of a man who has looked at himself from a vantage point he didn't choose and is still digesting what he saw. He told Owen about building the A-frame, the 3 years it had taken, the specific conversations with the contractor about the glass specification, the way he had stood in the empty frame before the glass went in, and looked at the mountains through the structural openings and understood what the building would feel like when it was finished. He described the glass as he had experienced it from inside, the way it made the mountains feel accessible without the cold, the way the morning light came in from the east in winter and crossed the floor in a rectangle that moved over the course of an hour. He said this without affect, without nostalgia, as straightforward description of something that had been true and was now not. Owen listened and wrote, and Frank let him write, which was a kind of permission, Eleanor noted. Later in the afternoon, Frank said something that had nothing to do with the house. He had been talking about his father, who had built the first iteration of the supply store from a converted grain warehouse in 1971, and the specific inventory decisions that had shaped how the town provisioned itself for winter. He said that his father had told him once that the most important thing in a hardware store was not the inventory, but the judgment, knowing what people actually needed when they came in, describing what they thought they needed. I stopped exercising that judgment about 15 years ago. Frank said, his voice carrying the flatness of a man who has arrived at a conclusion through careful accounting rather than sudden revelation. I started just telling people what they already believed. It's easier and it sells more merchandise. He paused. That woman came into my store for 2 years and I made her a punchline. He looked at Eleanor, who was at the workbench with her back to the room. He didn't finish the sentence because it didn't require finishing. Eleanor did not turn around. She was running a recalculation of the generator fuel consumption versus the projected solar recovery timeline. And the math was what it was, and Frank Dolan's reckoning was his own business. But something in her chest registered the sentence the way a structure registers a load. It was built to carry, not straining, not failing, just accepting the weight and distributing it through the available material. It was Owen who moved to Eleanor's workbench in the middle of the afternoon, ostensibly to refill his water bottle at the filtration tap, and noticed the cardboard tube that had rolled to the edge of the shelf when Eleanor had reached past it for a calibration tool earlier. He looked at it without touching it for a moment. He picked it up and looked at the end cap, which bore no label, and then at Eleanor. She didn't say anything, which was not the same as permission, and not quite its opposite either. Owen drew the sheet out of the tube with careful hands and unrolled it on the workbench, holding the corners down with 2 fingers each. He looked at it for a long time. Eleanor, standing 3 feet away with her back turned, knew exactly what he was looking at, not because she needed to see it, but because she had drawn every line of it, and the image was in her at a resolution that didn't require visual confirmation. The 2-bedroom plan, the south garden, the covered porch running the full east elevation, double the standard width, because the person who had asked for it had wanted enough room for 2 chairs and a table, and whatever distance between them the morning required. He drew this with you, Owen said. He was not asking. Eleanor looked at the tool in her hand. He pointed. I drew. There was a pause that had more structure to it than silence usually does. He wanted the east porch. She set the tool down. I told him the thermal loss on an east-facing covered structure in a northern climate was significant, that a south porch would be more efficient. Another pause. He said he didn't need efficient. He said he needed to see the sun come up. She looked at the wall in front of her, which was poured concrete, which told her nothing except that it was solid. I was right about the thermal load, she said. He was right about everything else. Owen was quiet for a long time after that. When he finally rolled the drawing carefully back into the tube and replaced the end cap and set it down, he did so with the specific care of someone returning something that has been trusted to them. He went back to his cot and opened his notebook and began writing with the quality of attention that Eleanor had come to recognize as his most focused, the pen moving without hesitation, the page filling without revision. She did not look at what he wrote, and he did not offer it. The storm made its first definitive concession at 11:40 p.m. on the sixth day. Eleanor was at the panel for her midnight log entry when the surface wind speed transmitter dropped in a single reporting interval to 34 miles per hour. Then 10 minutes later to 28. The barometric pressure jumped 2 millibars in the same 10-minute window. The snow deposition rate fell from 3 inches per hour to something under 2 for the first time since the storm's onset. She did not wake anyone. She logged the readings and sat with the instrument panel in the shelter's quiet and watched the numbers continue their slow migration towards something that could be survived at the surface, and she was aware. In the way she was aware of things she didn't entirely understand, that she felt something she had not been expecting to feel. Not relief, which was a word for the resolution of acute threat, and the threat was not yet resolved. Something quieter than that, the particular state of a person who has maintained vigilance at full load for a sustained period and is beginning to sense at the far edge of their perception that the load is decreasing. At 4:17 a.m., the seismic sensors report a cessation of surface vibration. The baseline reading on Eleanor's seismic panel was a flat line the panel calibrated at installation to show 0 when no surface activity exceeded the sensitivity threshold. For 8 days, it had never shown 0. It had shown the continuous low-frequency tremor of sustained wind loading on the surface structures, modulated by gust events, and the heavier mechanical signatures of the storm's worst passages. At 4:17 a.m. on the 8th day, the line went flat. She stared at it for a long time. The surface wind transmitter was reporting 6 miles per hour. Surface temperature, -11 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure stable and rising. Snow deposition rate negligible. The storm had not merely moderated, it had ended. Eleanor sat with this information for exactly long enough to confirm it was not an instrument anomaly. She ran the confirmation checks on the seismic sensor, the anemometer, and the pressure gauge independently, and all three agreed with each other. And then she stood up and took the pry bar from the storage hook beside the hatch and began the process of opening the shelter. She did not wake anyone for this either. She cycled the inner hatch, moved through the vestibule, and engaged the outer hatch's hydraulic levers with the specific anticipation of a person who has spent 8 days listening to something through solid material and is about to encounter it directly. The outer hatch opened against 3 feet of compacted snow that had settled into the entry tunnel since Frank had cleared it 2 days ago, and Eleanor began working through it with the pry bar in the methodical, unhurried rhythm that had characterized every physical task she had undertaken in the past 8 days. Cal woke at the sound of the hydraulic mechanism and came to the vestibule porthole to look without speaking. Eleanor was already in the entry tunnel, the beam of her headlamp moving up and to the left in the methodical pattern of someone working a problem rather than exploring. Cal went back to the living quarters and woke the others without drama, and by the time Eleanor had broken through to the surface, all 4 men were in the vestibule, watching through the porthole as gray pre-dawn light poured down through the openings she had made. She came back for them. She dropped back into the vestibule and looked at Frank, whose face was carrying the particular expression of a man who has been underground for 8 days and is trying to prepare himself for the fact that what he is about to see will not resemble what he left. "One at a time," she said. Frank laughed. The tunnel requires upper body rotation, and I don't want to pull you out of it. Frank accepted this with a nod that had no argument in it. Jesse went first because Eleanor had assessed that the act of emerging from the confined tunnel into open space would be better for his particular psychology if it happened before he could think about it at length, and she was correct. He went through the 3-foot passage with the focused efficiency of someone executing a task rather than surviving a metaphor. And when he pushed through the opening at the top and Eleanor heard his intake of breath from below, the sound told her everything about what he was seeing before she got there herself. Owen went second, Cal third. Eleanor guided Frank through the tunnel with her hand on his left arm, the two of them moving at the careful pace dictated by his ribs in the tunnel's geometry. And when he came up through the surface opening, she watched him stand upright in the pre-dawn light and stop. Cold River had been a town of 1,200 people and a particular physical character, the A-frames and ranch houses and commercial buildings clustered in the valley floor, the churches and the school and Frank's supply store and the Route 12 feed store and the gas station and the 23 businesses that constituted the town's economic structure. It had a water tower that was visible from Eleanor's property on clear days, painted with the town's name in letters large enough to read from the highway. It had a grid of streets that the county plows kept passable through normal winters, and the particular visual density of a place that had been occupied and built on and modified and repaired over a century of human use. What it had now was 15 feet of snow. The telephone poles that lined the main road were present only as the top 3 feet of their length emerging from the white surface like the final stubborn remnants of a civilization that had gone under. The water tower's tank was visible at the horizon, but the support structure was buried. Frank's A-frame existed as an arrangement of exposed timber, the ridge beam portions of the upper rafter structure projecting from a snowfield like the skeleton of something that had been there once. The valley floor was a flat, almost featureless, white expanse, under a sky that was above the horizon in every direction, the specific shade of deep blue that belongs to early morning at high altitude after a weather system has scoured the atmosphere completely clean. Frank stood at the lip of the surface opening for a long time, not speaking, not moving. The exposed timber of his house was directly in his sightline, 400 yards across the property, and he looked at it with the complete attention of a man giving something the full weight of his recognition. Eleanor stood to his left and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would improve on the silence. What broke it was not Frank. It was the sound from the direction of town, the mechanical cough of a diesel engine turning over somewhere under the snow, the particular resonance of heavy equipment establishing itself in a cold environment, and then faintly human voices, the specific cadence of people calling to each other across distance with the functional economy of people who were working not the cadence of distress or panic. Cold River was not silent. Cold River was occupied by people who were in the process of addressing what had happened to them. And the sound of that, the sound of a community turning its mechanical and human resources toward the problem of its own restoration, traveled across the flat white expanse with perfect clarity in the post-storm stillness. Frank looked toward the sound. Something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, not with any gesture that would have read as meaningful from a distance, but in the way the weight he had been carrying for 8 days found a slightly different distribution. "Tommy Reeves," he said. His voice was quiet. Eleanor looked at the direction the diesel sound was coming from. Route 12 was that direction. The feed store was that direction. "The sound is coming from his end of town," she said. Frank nodded slowly. It was not certainty, but it was geometry, and geometry was something. Cal had moved away from the group, slightly standing on the snowpack, with his hands in his pockets, and he was looking at the valley with the systematic attention he brought to every environment he found himself responsible for assessing. He looked at the buried infrastructure, the exposed timber, the flat white compression of what had been a topographically varied valley, and Eleanor could see him doing the calculation that she had already done the structural load on every roof that had been under that snowpack for 8 days, the buildings that would have held and the ones that wouldn't, the infrastructure damage to water and electrical systems, the scope of the recovery operation, that the sounds from town represented only the beginning of. At some point in the weeks ahead, he would teach 24 high school students how diesel engines worked, not because someone asked him to, but because he had recently learned in a concrete way what useful knowledge looked like when it was needed. He didn't know that yet, but the shape of it was already forming in him, the way decisions form before they become conscious as a direction, a lean towards something that had not existed before. Jesse had moved to the edge of the clearing and was standing with his face turned upward, not examining anything in particular, just receiving the open sky after 4 days, inside a space that had nearly killed him through the compression of its boundaries. His hands were in his jacket pockets to protect the blistered fingers, and he was standing with his chin slightly raised, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of someone learning something they will not be able to fully explain to anyone who wasn't there. Eleanor turned to look at the sky herself. She had known this moment was coming. She had had 8 days to prepare for it, which was more preparation than the first time she had not had 8 days before the Iowa sky turned yellow-purple. She had had the interval between turning toward the window and completing the turn. She had been standing in her kitchen, and then she had been a person whose life had a before and an after, and the sky had been the instrument of that division. She had spent 3 years and every resource she possessed putting solid material between herself and that sky, and now she was standing on top of the solid material, and the sky was directly above her, and it was the color that Wyoming sky becomes after a major storm, clear as a blue, so saturated and specific it seems almost artificial, the atmospheric equivalent of a breath taken all the way in. Her heart did what it did, the familiar drop, the compression in the sternum. Her body did not know the difference between this sky and the Iowa sky. It probably never would. The encoding ran deeper than reason. Eleanor stood in it anyway. She stood in it and let her heart do what it was doing, and she watched the blue above her, and she thought about Frank standing at the edge of his demolished property without collapsing. She thought about Jesse emerging from the tunnel with his blistered hands and his chin coming up. She thought about Cal standing in a dark vestibule for 28 minutes and not looking away. She thought about Owen writing in his notebook with the pen moving faster than thought, which was what happened when a person finally stopped editing themselves and started telling the truth. She thought about Daniel, who had wanted a porch facing east, not because he was wrong about thermal efficiency, but because he understood that some things are worth spending warmth on. The fear did not go away. She had not expected it to go away. What she had not expected was this, that standing under the sky with her heart in the configuration it was in, she was not standing alone under it. There were 4 other people on the snowpack. And while that did not change the sky or change what her body did in response to it, it changed by some principle. She could not have specified in advance the relationship between her and both of those things. She stayed on the surface for 22 minutes that first morning. She went back underground to monitor the systems because the systems still required monitoring. But she went back because the work required it, not because the sky had driven her back, and the distinction was not small. The days that followed the storm's end were structured by the practical demands of the situation rather than by any emotional agenda, which was the way Eleanor preferred her days to be structured. Frank organized the surface clearing operation with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years understanding how to move large quantities of material efficiently. He could not do the physical work himself, his ribs a genuine constraint rather than a negotiating position, but he directed Cal and Jesse through the establishment of excavated corridors, from the shelter's surface opening toward the property's driveway and then toward the access road. By the evening of the first post-storm day, they had established a passable route, and by the second day that route connected to the work being done from the town side where the county's plows and the residents' combined effort were working inward from Route 12. Owen stayed underground with Eleanor on that first day Having understood, without being asked, that the generator monitoring and the battery recovery assessment and the solar array evaluation required more than one person's attention. He was useful in the specific way that an intelligent person who pays careful attention to instruction is useful, and Eleanor worked alongside him through the technical assessments with the particular efficiency that develops between people who have learned each other's pace. In the afternoon of the second post-storm day, Robert Kinsey arrived. He came in with the first FEMA rapid assessment unit that reached the property, compact and methodical, carrying the professional weight of a man who has spent 2 decades arriving at scenes after the worst has happened and making order from the accounting. He walked the surface of Eleanor's property, noted the intact reinforced garage, the undamaged cabin with its blast shutters still sealed, and then he found the entry to the shelter and went down into it alone at his own request with Eleanor's permission, and was in it for 35 minutes. When he came up, he stood at the surface opening for a moment without speaking, and then he walked to where Eleanor was standing and looked at her with an expression that had recalibrated from wherever it had started. In 22 years of post-event assessment, he said, "I have not seen a private structure at this scale that was designed and executed at this level of rigor." He opened his clipboard and wrote something on it without looking down. "This event is going to drive a significant federal conversation about residential shelter standards in high-risk corridor zones." He looked up. "FEMA has a community resilience consultation program. Engineers, former first responders, planners. If you had interest in contributing." He held out a card. Eleanor looked at it. It was a plain government card, the same weight and finish as the business cards she had kept from her own practice, the ones she had left on Frank's counter 2 years ago. She took it and held it without putting it away. "I'll think about it," she said. Kinsey nodded once as though this was the answer he had assessed she would give, and continued his site inventory. That night, with the access corridor connected to the town road and outside communications reestablished, each of the men made calls that Eleanor could not hear but could observe from their effects. Owen used Eleanor's satellite communicator for 47 minutes, sitting in the vestibule with the hatch closed behind him for privacy. When he came back into the shelter, he was different in some way that was difficult to specify, the same person, but with a posture that suggested a weight had shifted rather than been removed. He looked at Eleanor and said nothing, and she nodded once, and that was the full extent of the exchange, and it was sufficient. He did not move to Denver, but he bought a plane ticket to see his children, and then he bought another, and the interval between tickets grew shorter rather than longer as the months passed. Cal made a shorter call, 11 minutes, to his adult daughter in Gillette. Eleanor heard only one side of it, and what she heard was a man doing the opposite of his default performance, speaking at reduced volume without the competent signaling that was his usual register, just telling someone he loved that he was going to be fine and asking whether she was. When he finished, he sat with the communicator in his hands for a moment and then put it carefully on the workbench and went to check the battery panel with the reliability of someone for whom action is also a form of emotion. Frank had already sent word through the county emergency communication system before anyone else made calls. A brief transmission name and status relayed through the sheriff's office to a list of contacts. Tommy Reeves had been confirmed safe. Mike Sauer and his son Jake had sheltered at the school, which was a single-story brick structure that had held. Frank received this information from a county worker who came through on the access corridor, and he stood in the snow and received it without visible reaction. And the only thing Eleanor saw change in him was that the quality of his stillness was different from the quality of his stillness the previous week, less dense. When he rebuilt, there were no floor-to-ceiling windows in the new structure. When people asked him why, he said he had looked at enough mountains. He didn't explain further. People who had been in Cold River that February understood without explanation, and people who hadn't were not the audience for the answer. On the fourth day after the storm, Eleanor climbed to the roof of her surface cabin to assess the solar array. She went up with a roof rake and worked from the ridge outward, pulling the accumulated snow off in sections, and when she cleared the first bank of panels, she watched the charge indicator on her wrist-mounted display begin to rise as the cells found the angle and started converting. She moved to the second bank, then the third. She stopped working when she reached the peak of the south-facing slope and sat down on the ridge. Cold River from the ridge looked like a wound in the process of healing the white expanse of the destruction, visible in every direction. The skeleton of Frank's A-frame standing above the snow, the sound of machinery from the valley floor, where the recovery work was generating a continuous mechanical testimony to the community's refusal to be defined by what the storm had done to it. She could see from the ridge the access corridors that had been cut from the main road into the residential areas, dark lines in the white expanse, the infrastructure of survival being assembled in real time. Her heart did what it always did under open sky. The compression, the drop, the specific physical language of a nervous system that had learned something it had not been able to unlearn. She was at the highest point on her property, with nothing between herself and the sky above her, and the sky was doing nothing except being sky, and her body did not know the difference between that and the Iowa afternoon. It probably never would. She sat on the ridge anyway because she had recently learned something she had not known before, which was that fear and remaining were not incompatible states. She had always treated them as mutually exclusive, as if the only honest response to terror was evacuation, as if staying in the presence of what frightened you was a form of dishonesty. The past 8 days had taught her something different. It had taught her that you could be afraid and still open the door, that you could be afraid and still send someone you were not sure would come back, that you could be afraid and still press your palm against the cold steel and count to 90 and then reach for the wheel anyway. She had known this abstractly. She was learning it in her body now, in the way physical learning happens through repetition, through the body being required to hold two things simultaneously that it would prefer to resolve into one. She stayed on the roof for 20 minutes. She went back underground when the sun dropped enough to reduce the panel input below the threshold she was targeting because the work required it. Jesse came to her 2 weeks after the storm on a Saturday morning and stood in the clear driveway with his hands in his pockets and his healed fingers handling themselves with the careful awareness of someone reacquainted with the ordinary mechanics of their own hands. He said he had been thinking about a project. He had talked to Cal and Owen and Frank, and they were all interested. He had an idea about a community shelter, not as large as Eleanor's, not as technically complex, but something that used the same principle at a scale that a town could maintain and access collectively. Something under the old community center or under the school where people had already proven they would gather when things went wrong. He said he didn't know how to design something like that. He said he thought she might. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She thought about the FEMA card in her jacket pocket, which she had not thrown away. She thought about Kinsey's assessment and what it had felt like to have the work recognized by someone qualified to recognize it. Not validation exactly, but confirmation, which was the form of recognition that had always mattered most to her. She thought about the drawing on her workbench unrolled now and held flat by a calibration weight at each corner, no longer in its tube. "I'll need site surveys," she said. "Soil profiles, bedrock assessment, utility mapping. And the county will need to reclassify the zoning before we break ground." Jesse nodded. He had expected requirements. He had not expected her to start listing them. He was smart enough to understand the difference. "When can you start?" he asked. Eleanor looked past him at the valley where the machinery sounds continued their patient work, where Cold River was in the process of becoming again a place that people lived. "Monday," she said. She went back inside and sat at her workbench. The drawing was still there, the east porch, the south garden, the two-bedroom house that had existed in the space between pointing and drawing. She looked at it for a while. Then she opened a fresh sheet of drafting vellum and positioned it to the right of the existing drawing and picked up her pencil, not to copy the old drawing, to begin the next one. The shelter around her was warm and solid, and precisely what she had built it to be. Not a monument to fear and not a cage built from grief, but a foundation. The kind that was useful not because it protected what was built on top of it from everything, but because it gave what was built on top of it something real to stand on. Outside the valley continued its recovery under a sky that was as it had always been and would always be entirely indifferent to the specific human standing under it, which was, Eleanor thought, putting pencil to paper, not the same as hostile. She had spent 3 years treating those two things as identical. The difference, now that she could feel it, was the size of everything.